All right, there we go. Little disclaimer there. So this past couple of weeks, I want to just recap. One of the most important things that we have covered in this course is the idea that Mashiach is something that we have an active role in his coming. It's not something that just happens upon us, but something that we are working towards, and actually something that we've been working towards since the beginning of time. Mashiach is not something that is one person coming to save the planet, but rather it's a collection of deeds that we all, every single one of us, participate in on a daily basis to make this a reality. And it's something that we've been doing for thousands, since the beginning of time. It's a process. It's a process that God had in mind when he created the world. That is slowly unfolding. So with that said, we've discussed a lot about Mashiach in the last couple of weeks. And one of the things that we have touched upon is what actually will take place when the Mashiach arrives. And tonight, what we're going to take a better look at what this reality will look like. Now, let's just open up the class just for a few suggestions here. What have you heard? Maybe it's something that you heard here in the class or something that you know from a previous learning experience. What will take place during the coming of Mashiach? Is there something that you can tell me about what you know about this very unique period? Please unmute yourself if you'd like to share.
There'll be peace on earth.
Okay.
The lion will lie down with the lamb.
Okay, very good, excellent. We'll get to that. Anyone else? What? Tell me something that you heard or expect, anticipate will take place in the coming of Mashiach.
There end times, possibly. I know that's kind of like Christian talk, but maybe an end of history, an end of history being that there won't be any more wars or any more big political events, because all that will be unnecessary.
Okay, an era of peace. Very good. Okay, excellent. Anyone else?
He will gather the Jewish nation from all four corners of the earth.
Okay, then gathering of the exiles. Very good. We're going to get to that too. Anybody else? All right, well, we have a lot to cover. So, Yogi Berra once said it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. So, we are going to do this. We're going to be making predictions about the future. However, typically predictions are made by people who understand what may or may, what has happened in the past, and they can see what might or may not happen in the future. However, what we know about the Mashiach, times of Mashiach, is not just based on, putting our finger up in the air and seeing which way the wind's blowing, but actually it's based on the words of the prophets, who the prophets have been given divine inspiration by God, explaining what will take place in the end of times, or to quote Howard, just that was on my lips actually, but in the times of Mashiach is actually a better way of putting it. And these words from the prophets, while they are somewhat ambiguous, so that they don't give us an absolute clear picture, we do have some idea of what can happen. Maimonides, for one, has been given us a pretty good description based on the words of the prophets and the sages who interpreted the words of the prophets, to give us a pretty clear picture, pretty accurate picture. Now, we only have 90 minutes to do this class, so we are kind of limited in how much we can discuss. In addition to the fact that we're talking about somewhat of a vague topic to begin with. It's not something that we know. It's not something that's happened. It's not like describing Mount Sinai or going out of Egypt. So suffice it to say, look at this class not so much as an exact telling of the future, but perhaps, as a movie preview. So the information that you walk away with won't be telling you this is exactly the way it's going to happen, but kind of as you walk away from a movie preview, you kind of got an idea of what will happen, and you're going to wait for the real thing to come out, and then you go and watch it. And that's what we're doing, obviously. We are going to be having a very good preview about what will happen when Mashiach comes, but obviously it may look a whole lot different when the real deal arrives. So let's get right to it. And we're going to begin the class with a text from Maimonides. And I mentioned this before. This course has a lot of text from Maimonides because he was the only one who, only rabbinic source that spends a lot of time from a halachic standpoint. That's a key point over a key definition from a halachic standpoint. He writes he writes about the Mashiach in his book of Jewish law, right? So there are many who write about Mashiach in all sorts of different texts of scholarly texts, but when you describe something in a book of law, that carries more weight to it. So Maimonides is kind of deciding to include the happenings of the Messianic time in his code of Jewish law. That's very telling. So let's take a look about what he says. This is in Maimonides' Mishnah Torah, Laws of Kings. Let's see what he says. Now, what this is perhaps the aha moment of the class, right? Is that Maimonides is going to tell us something very unique, which is that according to him, when the Mashiach comes, there won't be necessarily any miraculous change. So all the miracles that people have heard about or been perhaps anticipating, according to Maimonides, these do not need to take place. Okay, let's take a look at that in text number 1. Howard, you're right on my screen in the center. Please read to me text number 1, page 1A, page 247 in your book.
Do not presume that in the Messianic age any facet of the world's nature will change or that there will be innovations in the work of creation. The world will continue according to its pattern.
All right. Now that's that's a big statement you're saying right up front. Of course, this contradicts the verse from Isaiah. I think someone mentioned here just a few moments ago. So why don't we go back to Susie and read for us, please, text number 1b, which seems to tell a very different story about what will happen when Mashiach comes. 1b, page 248, if you don't mind unmuting yourself.
The wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the young goat, the calf and the yearling will be with the lion, and the little child will lead them all.
This is really quite the prophecy and quite the description, very descriptive, right? And clearly, this is very, very miraculous. That these animals will change their nature to the point where the predator will no longer eat its prey, which is how Isaiah is describing. And that seems to contradict with what Maimonides just said. So of course we want to try to reconcile the two. How do we reconcile the two? So Maimonides goes straight at it. He's ready for this. And he says, this is what it means. We need to understand the words of the prophets a little differently. So let's read text number 1c. Jeff, good to have you on board tonight. Page 249, text number 1c, back to Maimonides. He's forewarning the question we just gave. Yes, go ahead.
The wolf will dwell with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the young goat. These words are an allegory and parable. The interpretation of the prophecy is that the Jews will dwell at peace together with those wicked Gentiles who had sought to devour them like a wolf and a leopard. They will no longer steal or destroy, but live at peace with Israel. Similarly, other Messianic prophecies of this kind are allegories. Only in the Messianic era will we understand their true meaning.
Wow. So there you go. There we have it. Maimonides says it. This is not going to happen. I'm sorry if you've been looking forward to seeing the wolf and the lamb lie together. That's not necessarily going to happen according to Maimonides, and it's purely allegorical. So what is going to happen? Susie, 1 second. What is going to happen? Well, Maimonides sees this as the wolf and the lamb being the Jewish nation, I guess, being the lamb and the wolf being the aggressors. They will no longer find fault with the Jews and find ways to victimize, to act in a predatory way to the Jews. Rather, they will be at peace. In other words, anti-Semitism will be gone. The ADL will have to find a new job. No longer will they have anti-Semitism to follow. In other words, there'll be a level of peace. People will live in harmony one with each other. Wouldn't that be lovely? I think I would prefer that over the wolf and the lamb. So clearly that is just an allegory for a lack of or the seizing of anti-Semitism. I think in today's day and age, that's all something that we could look forward to, a time of no anti-Semitism. Okay, we got a question from Susie. Yes, Susie, what was your question?
When I was going over this, I kind of took a umbrage with the word wicked Gentiles.
Uh-huh.
Even though it was those wicked Gentiles. You know, if you see a text and it says those wicked Jews, it's kind of a
But have you read the Torah? Torah is full of descriptions of wicked Jews. You got to call a spade a spade. There are good Jews and there are unfortunately wicked Jews, and there are good Gentiles and there are unfortunately wicked Gentiles, and we have been at the receiving end of wicked Gentiles for thousands of years. That doesn't take away from the fact that many Gentiles are righteous Gentiles who have done tremendous service, not just to their own communities, but to
Were
us.
you thinking of Bernie Madoff?
You know, you can think of anyone, but you can think of Jews who in World War II. I just saw this posted on Facebook. Forget the fella's name, who was a right-hand man of the Gestapo, and who had no problem in handing over Jews to the Nazis. So you know, unfortunately, you have people who don't live up to what their God-given potential, you know, and they do wicked things. It's true by Jews and Gentiles. Unfortunately, though, over the centuries, Jews have suffered far more by the hands of Gentiles than they have Jews. Although it's fair to say, Jews have hurt each other, unfortunately, in a very difficult, very bad ways. But thank you for that anyway.
well, but not to dwell on it. If everyone is living in peace together, I believe the wickedness would pretty much subside.
Right, correct. That's a great point. So you're asking why we call them wicked. Well, that's just a way to describe them. Clearly, when they are no longer harassing the Jews, they lose their wickedness. What is interesting is we'll see later on in the class that actually Gentiles have a very important role in the Messianic era, and just as Jews do, it will be their choice and it'll be an easier choice for them to realize their potential. But absolutely, Gentiles will have less reason to be wicked when the Messiah comes. I hear your point. It's a good point, well taken, and we hope that indeed Gentiles will cease being wicked and hurtful to the Jewish people. Yeah, okay. Let's move along to another text, the way that the Maimonides understands this prophecy from Isaiah. Let's read text number 2, page 250. I think we're on for, let's see, Christy.
Our sages taught, Talmud Sanhedrin 99a, there will be no difference between the current age and the Masonic era, except the emancipation from our subjugation to the Gentile governments.
Okay. There you go, Susie. Gentile governments. They're Gentile. As nice. Okay. So, but here's another way to describe the Messianic era as being a time when Jews who for thousands of years have been subjugated to different governments. And sometimes they have been living in foreign lands where the governments have been tremendously generous to the Jews, but they have been at the mercy of those governments. And even in those countries where they've been, where they have lived in harmony, things could change on a dime. And we know that has happened in the past. Germany is a good example of that. Spain is a very good example, another very good example. And we don't take our liberty, even in this country, for granted. Even Israel, where they are, so we're always under the subjugation of nations. Even in Israel, where we are blessed to have a state of Israel with its own army, we know very well that Israel itself works within the framework of many nations, some explicit, some not so explicit, telling them what to do. In other words, even Israel is under the subjugation of the nations. And all sorts of things have to happen as a result of that subjugation. It's not, I don't need to go into all of what those things are, but enough to say that it's not totally autonomous. It has to work under the, like any country really, is under some influence of other countries, especially smaller countries that are influenced that are forced of their influence by bigger countries. So when Mashiach comes, the Jewish people in general, wherever they may be living, and we will soon see that the Jews will be encouraged to move to Israel. But it's fair to say, even though those Jews who are not in Israel, but definitely those who are, will not be under the subjugation, according to Maimonides, of the Gentile nations. And they'll be able to practice their religion freely. I think it's fair to say that Israel is today, from a religious standpoint, clearly Jews can practice their religion perhaps freer than any other place in the world, but there are things that go on in Israel that make Judaism difficult, even in Israel. Okay, so we have let's recap what Maimonides has said. Till now, in Mashiach's times, the Jewish people will be able to continue to, the world will continue to operate without any miracles taking place. And right now, the only thing that's changing is the end of anti-Semitism and the end of the subjugation of the Jewish people, especially in the land of Israel. Okay, so let's move on. That's the first.
Where was that passage that she read? Was that page 250?
I believe it was page 250, yes. That was the last text. Hi, Joe. Good to have you on board. Okay,
Thanks.
so let's move along to the next, perhaps, novelty about what will happen when Mashiach comes. This is about the Holy Temple. Let's take a look at text number 3. Joe, since you just came on board, read for us text number 3, page 241.
The Messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. He will build the temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. In his days, the observance of all the statutes will return to their previous state.
Okay, so I want to bring up a slide, because this slide is going to tell us, going to go review the next couple of parts of the class. Let's take a look at this. So here we have the 4 things that we're going to discuss about in the next couple of chapters of this class. The first thing is we're going to discuss the renewing of the Davidic dynasty. That's I think we've discussed already. The concept of Mashiach is renewing of David's dynasty. Building the temple, gathering the dispersed of Israel, and restoring the observance of all the mitzvahs. So let's go with the second point, building the temple. So we discussed last week that this was going to come from someone who comes from King David. And we also discussed, in other words, Mashiach will be from the Davidic dynasty. In addition, we're going to discuss, which is where the temple will take place. Now, this is interesting. So where do you think where does the temple go? On none other than Temple Mount. And when this happens, which is, by the way, where the first and second temple stood. When this happens, this will cause a gathering of the diaspora back to Israel, and that will allow for the restoration of many mitzvah that we don't perform today. Now, this idea of our praying for the restoration of the temple is one of perhaps the most, we discussed this, I think, in the first or second class. It's something that we are continuously praying for. Interestingly, one of the places that we mention it more than or as much as any other time is in the Haggadah. Let's take a look at this next slide. And here you have a picture that's in the Haggadah that the picture is underneath a song. You know, at the end of the Seder, we sing a lot of songs. This is a song that is sung. It goes something like this: Kadeshu, Rachemhu, Shakaihu, Takifu, Yivne Beisakarai, Bimheira, Bimheira, Biyamenu Bekarai, Kelbene, Bnei Beisavakarov. Excuse my singing, a little out of tune. But that's the song. And of course, it's a song that is sang at the end of the Seder. Many communities have the custom to sing songs, and this song is all about the rebuilding of the temple. And this picture is a non-accurate picture, at least not according to most sources in the Talmud or beyond the Talmud that depict the temple, what it looked like. But this is a picture of the temple, not an accurate one, but a picture of the temple. So we see that what is Mashiach's role going to be? To rebuilding the temple. All right. Now, what is the temple? Let's take a look at a more accurate picture of the temple, because you'll soon see. And I'm going to show you a video, and you'll see that this more accurate picture looks very different than this depiction in the Haggadah. So let's take a look at this video. It's a fascinating video that will show you the temple that will be rebuilt with the coming of Mashiach, among other things. Okay, let's take a look.
God told the Jews at Sinai to build a temple so that his presence could dwell among them, a place to worship, to gather as a nation, to receive atonement, inspiration, and instruction. Half a millennia later, God's desired location for a permanent home was revealed to King David in the ancient city of Jerusalem, atop a hillside known for Abrahamic times as Mount Moriah. David's son, King Solomon, completed a magnificent structure that attracted the title Beit HaMikdash and Beit HaPirah. It was fashioned with much gold, expensive woods, and precious materials. When it was completed in 827 BCE, the nation gathered to witness God's presence fill the temple. The mountain gained a new name, Har Habayit. At its summit, a stone building rose to enormous height. Within its gaping entrance was the Ulam, a lobby, beyond which was the Kodesh, furnished with 3 golden items, an altar for incense, a 7-branched menorah, and a table with racks for the showbread. At the sanctuary's far end, a separated area enclosed the temple's core, its most sacred location, the Kodesh HaKodashim, that held the Oron, the Ark of God, containing the tablets that Moses delivered at Sinai. The Ark of God rested upon a naturally protruding plateau, known as the Foundation Rock. Immediately outside the building, the courtyard of the Kohanim, priests, held a massive stone sacrificial altar with a lengthy access ramp. Nearby was the Kior, a cistern for rinsing hands and feet, and a platform for the Levites to chant psalms and play instruments. Further back, a larger area was designed for public assembly, known as the Women's Courtyard. It included an extensive wooden balcony for women. The nation would gather 3 times each year to celebrate the festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. The compound was surrounded by a massive wall and contained a series of steps, numerous gateways and guard posts. The temple's layout was exceptionally efficient, with compartments and chambers for every possible need, such as storage areas for wood, oil, and other materials, production and preparation areas, rooms for clothing, for weaponry in case of attack, ritual immersion pools, sleeping and eating areas, tool and instrument reserves, lockers for the priests, a charity room, a hall for Torah study, a chamber for the Sanhedrin, a lounge for temple officials, a repair workshop, animal holdings, ticket stations, and so on. There were separate entrances for distinct purposes, an oversight system, and honor guards. A small stream ran beneath the temple, which was used to maintain cleanliness. The temple stood for 4 centuries. It was destroyed by the Babylonian army in 423 BCE, rebuilt in 349 BCE, and stood for 4 centuries more until it was destroyed by the Romans in 69 of the Common Era. Through his prophets, God promised the Jews a third and eternal temple in the Messianic era, from which his presence will spread to the world, embracing all of humanity.
This is just as a side note, the laws of the temple are, there's the laws of the building of the temple, and there's so much detail in that video. It's just amazing because there are entire tractates, numerous tractates of the Talmud that discuss the building of the temple, the service of the temple. In fact, I'm studying right now the tractate of Yuma, which describes, among many other things, the temple sacrifice, the temple service for Yom Kippur. One whole tractate discussing, among other things, but mainly focused on the temple service of the high holiday, Yom Kippur, and a lot more. So there's a lot to be discussed, and this is just a sampling of the intricacies that went into this magnificent building. Maybe I'm just thought about this now. Perhaps there's a period of time where we commemorate the destruction of the first and second temple, and there is a custom to actually study the building of the temple. And if those are interested, JLI many years ago did a mini course on the building of the temple. And I gave it like 10, 12 years ago. It was a long time ago, but people found it very interesting. And if you're interested, let me know. Perhaps during the 3 weeks, as it is known, it's during the summertime, we can redo that course. And it's really interesting to see the detail of the temple that stood in Jerusalem, and God willing will be rebuilt. So that's just maybe an idea that just came to mind as watching that video. If it's something you're interested in, let me know at the end of the class or an email afterwards. Okay. Now,
Rabbi?
Yes.
I have a question about the temple. So Rome flattened out the mountainous area. So is the temple going to be built on the exact location, or is the mountain going to be, or is Jerusalem going to be raised up to its original state?
I never heard that they flattened out the mountain, but regardless,
Were you thinking of Masada?
Maybe.
No, Masada is not flattened either. Masada is still its original height.
It's not flattened, it's just a ramp up there, but it's not flat either, right?
Yeah. So anyway, the Temple Mount is still very much a mount. It's on a mountain, and it's a more elevated space in Jerusalem. I don't know if it's the most elevated, but it seems to be. Perhaps there was some flattening that went on. I'm not certain about that, but we'll have to wait and see what happens when the Mashiach comes, if it's going to be made taller, as perhaps you are suggesting. Anyway, let's to get back to what Alex did just say was that the Romans did destroy the temple, and as did the Babylonians. Now, what is going to happen when Mashiach comes? Not only will this space, which, by the way, as many of you probably know, if not all of you know, the Temple Mount has a different type of temple there right now. And if you're looking for any excuse for Mashiach that has not yet arrived, it's the fact that there is a mosque right on the Temple Mount. But believe it or not, when Mashiach comes, that mosque will no longer be there, and it will be replaced with a temple. Now that sounds very awesome or very unbelievable, but actually, it's not only will it be there despite the Muslims who currently have their mosque there, but it will be there with their help. In other words, if they will recognize, as the whole world will recognize, in the oneness of God, and that God, indeed, his center place and focus, spiritual focus, will be this very temple, and therefore they will give all the resources that are necessary for the rebuilding of the temple. In fact, this idea that the nations of the world will actually contribute to the building of the temple, and definitely won't be destroying it, is something that is suggested in the Midrash. Let's read this in text number 4. Let's see who's reading for us next. Go here. Jean, could you read for us text number 4? Excuse me, page 253.
Okay. If the nations of the world knew how beneficial the Holy Temple was for them, they would have surrounded it with fortifications in order to guard it.
Wow. So here we have the idea.
Wow.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Jean. So this is the idea that clearly the nations of the world, back when they destroyed it, as with everything about the world today, it's a concealment of godliness. And it was this very concealment of godliness that allowed them in the first place to destroy the temple. Well, when the Messianic era arrives and there'll be a revelation of godliness, then not only will they not destroy the temple that will be built there, but they will aid in its creation. And perhaps we too have to believe that this is a possibility, not a possibility, but something that will happen, and that this can happen because of the concept of Mashiach, which is the revelation of godliness that will make it possible to happen. So before the revelation of godliness that will be present in the coming of Mashiach, indeed, it is perhaps unbelievable to think that somehow the Temple Mount will be returned, and the rebuilding of the temple will be, and the temple will be rebuilt there. But what we know about what will happen when Mashiach comes, that there'll be this awareness of godliness that allows us to believe that in the coming of Mashiach, this rebuilding will take place. More importantly, it won't just be a Jewish home. It will be a home for all nations of the world to come and recognize and be there for their service to Hashem. Which, by the way, did happen in the times of the first temple, King Solomon's temple. It was known as a place where Gentiles would come, Gentile kings would come and bring offerings. It was a very respected place. This will happen again when Mashiach comes, that the Gentiles of the world will respect and find their inspiration, the spiritual inspiration, from the temple. Let's read this in text number 5. This is a prophecy, a house for all nations, text number 5. Laurel, please read for us, if you don't mind, page 254, text number 5. You have to unmute yourself, Laurel.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can, loud and clear.
Okay, the word that Isaiah, son of Amos, prophesied concerning Judah and Israel, it shall be at the end of the days that the mountain of God's home shall be firmly established at the top of the mountains. It shall be raised above the hills, and all the nations shall stream to it. Many peoples shall go, and they shall say, Come, let us go up to God's mountain, to the house of the God of Jacob, and let him teach us of his ways, and we will go in his paths.
Beautiful. Thank you. So that's the idea, that Jews and Gentiles will find meaning in the temple that will be rebuilt, and it will be this home of universal spiritual presence.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
Who's going to tear down the current temple of the mount?
You. 1 second. You didn't sign up. It was in the last lesson. We asked everyone to sign up. You know what? The temple will if we merit, God will take care of that for us.
Okay.
If not, we'll have to find some other way. But as we said, there won't. This won't be a. Let's be clear about this, because I don't want any what's the word, vigilantism going on from this class. I don't want anybody taking up arms, heading to Israel to take down the mosque over there, and then blaming it on some rabbi in Westminster who inspired them to. No, first of all, it's even questionable today whether a Jew may even step foot on Temple Mount due to the holiness of the space. Number one. Number two, what we'll soon see is that the temple will actually be rebuilt before the ingathering of the exiles, and it will be done by Mashiach. So it's not something that we need to worry about in the sense of how we're going to do it, but it will be a Messianic. When we know who Mashiach is, and when that person is, that process has begun, then this will be part of that process, and it will be a very peaceful process. Okay.
Maybe I shouldn't say this, but I think that the mosque on the Temple Mount is built on top of a temple to Jupiter. And the real location of our temple is in the middle courtyard between the mosque and the Dome of the Rock.
Okay. That's, you know what, I'm not going to, so I think what Joe's saying is there's room for all three temples, or for two temples up there. Joe's making a compromise. Okay, thank you. All right.
That's not a compromise. It's simply the way history happened.
Yep. It's, you know what, I can't speak to that point, but thank you for the suggestion, and who knows, maybe it could be you're correct.
Rabbi?
Okay. Yes.
What's the reason why we can't step on Temple Mount?
So Temple Mount is a very holy place, and there are many Jews many opinions who hold that as long as there is we are in a state of impurity, then we shouldn't be on sacred ground as a Temple Mount.
So then would it just revert when the Mashiach comes and Rambam says it reverts back to its natural state? The temple would just become dust then? Because how could we not?
No, that we would have to go through a state of purification in order for us to ascend up there. Now, this view is
Thank
not.
you.
This view is that okay. Let's move along because we're getting a little carried away on some side notes here, and we want there's more to cover. But suffice it to say that right now, those many opinions that say that we should not ascend Temple Mount, and there are other opinions who say we may. Hence, Jews go up there and typically under police escort so that they don't get beaten up by Muslim worshippers who sometimes can be very violent against the Jewish presence on Temple Mount. Okay, let's leave that alone and move on to the next. So we've discussed the lack of anti-Semitism, the lack of subjugation of the Gentile nations to the Jewish people, and we've also discussed the rebuilding of the temple on Temple Mount. Now, next thing that we want to talk about, which is the ingathering of the Jewish people. So Maimonides, interestingly, again, Maimonides, when he wrote his text, the Code of Jewish Law, he did this not just because he had a whim of what would take place, and he just kind of figured it out, or he felt this would just feel good, but he based his text on Talmudic sources. So the order that Maimonides describes in what will happen when Mashiach comes is very telling. And what he says is that first Mashiach will come, then he will build the temple, and then thirdly, you will have the ingathering of the exiles. So this is an important distinction to make. So we have had ingathering of exiles, otherwise known as aliyahs, to Israel for the last 130, 140 years. And Jews have been moving to Israel slowly since the destruction of the Second Temple, although clearly in much bigger numbers in the last 130 years. There was the first aliyah, the second aliyah, and then multiple aliyahs after that. However, most of those aliyahs were inspired by Jews who were running away from persecution. Not necessarily the holiness of the land of Israel, although definitely Jews were inspired and are inspired to move there because of the holiness of the land of Israel, but many because of persecution in their native lands. What makes the aliyah that will take place when Mashiach comes is that the Jews will see the Bet HaMikdash being built, and then that will act as a magnet for the Jews to want to return to the land of Israel. So this is just an important piece of information here, just to know historically what we should anticipate. First, Mashiach comes. Second, he builds the temple. Thirdly, you have the ingathering of the Jewish people. Okay, that means all of us here will find a new home in Jerusalem. Now, this brings us to a very interesting topic, which is, okay, so we know that me and Howard are heading to Jerusalem when Mashiach comes, and everyone else on this chat, on this phone, on this video screen. But what about the 10 lost tribes? What happens to them? So what did you just say, Rabbi? The 10 what? I'm sure you've all heard of the 10 lost tribes, right? But let me tell you if you haven't. Who are the 10 lost tribes? So this is a fascinating piece of Jewish history. You know that King Solomon built the first temple. And really, this was the pinnacle in Jewish history, that perhaps there wasn't a better time there wasn't a better time up until that point, and probably there wasn't a better time after that point for Jews living in the land of Israel. The temple had been built. There was an enormous amount of respect for the Jewish people, and foreign dignitaries would come to, as I said earlier, to the Temple Mount with offerings to Hashem. King Solomon was widely respected. Peace reigned at the land of Israel. Everything was going great until, I think it was right after King Solomon died. Yep, after his reign, the Jewish people split into two. Perhaps the biggest tragedy to befall the Jewish people, one of the biggest tragedies. And as a result, you had the 10 tribes who moved to the north of Israel, and they were known as the tribes of Israel. They were the tribes of Israel. They were the majority of the tribes, and they called themselves actually the Kingdom of Israel, and because they made up the majority of the Jews. But they separated themselves from Jerusalem, which Jerusalem was under the two remaining tribes, which was Judah and Benjamin, in addition to the Kohanim and the Levites, who remained in Jerusalem, which is, by the way, okay, we'll get there in a second. So what happens next? Well, the Jews separate themselves from the Jews who moved to the north of Israel, separate themselves from the Jews who live in the south, in the southeast part of Israel, southwest part of Israel, if you want to divide it like that. I'm not sure geographically you might call it that, but Jerusalem and the rest of the country, and they have a separate kingdom. Now, what happens next is that the Assyrians, who were living in the northern part of the north of Israel, pretty much where Syria is today, had greater ambitions to take over the land of Israel, and began by conquering this northern territory that was the area of the kingdom of Israel. And over a number of devastating blows to this.
Rabbi?
1 second,
Rabbi?
don't interrupt. Hold your thought. Hold your thought. Thank you, Joe.
Okay.
Hold your thought. And after a few devastating blows, they exiled all the Jews from this northern kingdom of Israel to bunch of foreign lands. Now
It
this
wasn't the Syrians.
I said Assyrians, right?
Assyrians.
Correct. That's what I said, Joe.
From
Assyrians.
Iraq. From Iraq. Okay, I thought you said Syrians.
They were, but I'm not sure where they were from. They were, I believe they conquered from
They
the
were from
northern part
Iraq.
of
They were
Israel.
not-
If they were from Iraq or not, I cannot say for certain. I will take your word.
They were in fact from Iraq, outside of Israel's territory.
Okay, let's go with Joe. They were from Iraq. Okay. Regardless, that this decimated the Jewish people as a nation in the sense that a big majority of the Jewish people were now lost. And till today, we don't know where those nations are. So if you can imagine this group of people that were no longer part of the Jewish people because they had been assimilated amongst the nations, left just two tribes from these, and these two tribes were from where most of the stories that we know that took place after the Torah was given, the first temple, the second temple, the story of Purim, story of Hanukkah, all this takes place with the two remaining tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and the Kohanim and the Levites who remain in the land of Israel. Now, the fate of these 10 tribes is a mystery till this day, and we don't know where they are. We've heard, I'm sure many of you have heard stories of nations who claim to be part of the 10 lost tribes, but there is no way we can confirm if indeed they are or not. But what's relevant today is, and this is very fascinating actually, is the idea that when Mashiach comes, there will be the ingathering of the exiles, and this is fascinating that it will include the 10 lost tribes. Now that I believe is perhaps if Mashiach can identify the 10 lost tribes, he is really the Mashiach, because this would be very difficult. But let's take a look at this inside. The Mishnah actually discusses this, whether or not the 10 lost tribes will be included in the ingathering of the exiles. So I said earlier, the fact that Gene and Joe and Joel and Howard and Steve and everyone else is going to be ingathered, that's we know for certain. But the 10 lost tribes, we're not so sure about whether they will be part of the Messianic redemption, the Messianic ingathering of the exiles. And for this, we actually have two opinions in the Talmud. Text number 6. Joel, have you read for us this evening? Joel?
Not yet. Not yet.
Take it away. Text number 6.
The 10 tribes are not destined to return, as it is stated. God cast them into another land like this day. Just as the day passes, never to return, so have they gone into exile, never to return. This is the view of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer stated, like this day, just as the day darkens and then brightens, so the 10 tribes who experience darkness will in the future experience light.
All right, so thank you, Joel, for that. So as you know, very often the Talmud, when it has various of difference of opinions, it's those differences of opinions are based on an understanding of a biblical verse. And that's what we have here. We have a biblical verse that says from Deuteronomy, God cast them into another land like this day. What does that mean, like this day? That seems to be a word that doesn't add necessarily a lot on the surface. So of course the rabbis, this is what the Talmud does all the time. It says 1 second, this verse is not redundant. It's actually these words, just like this day, are not redundant. And in fact, these 3 words become the basis of the 2 opinions of whether or not the 10 tribes will return. Rabbi Akiva says, just like day is here and gone tomorrow, so too are the exiles here today and gone. When the day passes, so the day is gone. So too, when the exiles leave the land, the 10 tribes, leave the land of Israel, they are gone, never to return. Never, even in the Messianic times. And then you have Rabbi Eliezer who says, like this day, no, just like what happens when a day ends, it darkens, and then it gets bright again. So too, the 10 tribes, they too even so, yes, they're experiencing darkness right now in the sense that they are lost. They will one day return. Now, how is that possible? Now, let's just remember that the 10 tribes, when they left the land of Israel, there were no books. They couldn't take with them the Art Scroll Chumash to learn how to continue learning the laws of the Torah. There were no books in the laws of the Torah. There were a few scrolls, perhaps, but there was not a lot of written information about the laws and the customs. And everything was transmitted already at that time. The Mishnah had not yet been written, nor had the Talmud. And so it's safe to assume that these Jews, without much, books to help them navigate in a foreign land, will very much assimilate. The Jews were gone for 130 years. In other words, the 10 tribes were sent away from the land of Israel 130 years before the rest of the Jews were sent out of the land of Israel by the Babylonians. So this really didn't afford them a lot of opportunity to remain very Jewish in a very assimilated lands. I spent a long time, a year, and then I went back many times to the former Soviet Union right after the breakup of the former Soviet Union in the early 90s. And the former Soviet Union, the Soviet Union went out of its way to pretty much decimate Judaism and many other religions, but Judaism in particular, from its borders. And it forbade the public teaching of Torah to children and many practices, etc. And you know what? For the most part, they were successful. They did to the Jewish people in Russia what the 10 tribes, what the exiles, the Assyrians did to the 10 tribes. It totally assimilated them. When I arrived in the early 90s, this was about 70 years of communism had done its job on the Jewish people. Massive assimilation and mass ignorance on Jewish law. The difference was 70 years was not enough to snuff out Judaism from Russia. And thankfully, Judaism came roaring back, and that is the case till today. But if it can happen in 70 years under communism, you can imagine what living as a Jew in a foreign land can do for hundreds of years, with no system to support it. It would be the Judaism becomes impossible to follow and impossible to keep. So for all practical purposes, it's assumed that the 10 tribes are indeed lost. So back to the question, if this is the case, how could Rabbi Eliezer believe that there will be the ingathering of the 10 tribes? So the answer is that Jeremiah, who was a prophet at that time, it is said he went to some of these foreign lands and enabled some of them to return to the land of Israel, where there were 2 remaining tribes left. So within the Jewish people, even back then, there were a representation of the 10 other tribes who had been exiled but had been returned by Jeremiah. That is one opinion. So therefore, today, even so, we don't know who those people are, but when the Mashiach comes, he will be able to identify within the Jewish people which ones come from the tribe of which ones come from the 10 remaining tribes, the 10 lost tribes, excuse me. They won't be the ones that were lost. They were the ones that were assimilated amongst the Jewish people in the land of Israel by Jeremiah. So that's a fascinating piece of information.
Rabbi?
Yes.
What about that people are saying since Israel was created again in 1948, you have the Jews coming from India and Ethiopia and Yemen. Is that an ingathering, or is that an ingathering separate from the 10 tribes? Or what about these people, Jewish people coming from all over the world in the last 70
Very good question. Excellent question, that is. And what Jeff's asking is basically, do we recognize the many aliyahs that have taken place as part of the ingathering of the exiles? And the answer is yes. In other words, just like we can recognize that there is advances in medicine, advance in the lack of poverty, and all the good things that have taken place as preparations for the coming of the Mashiach, so too we can recognize that when Jews emigrate en masse from Russia, from Ethiopia, India, you name it, this is again in preparation for the coming of the Mashiach. What is important what we differentiate perhaps from and what we'll differentiate here is to note that while this is a preparation, it is not the beginning. The Messianic Mashiach has not yet become any. The ingathering of the exiles doesn't make it the beginning of the Mashiach's arrival. It makes it the preparation. As much of a preparation as the fact that we now have the opportunity to have the ability to hear through cochlear implants and the ability to see through cataract surgery, etc., so too was it in gatherings of the exile a preparation for the coming of Mashiach. But again, let's just move along. What is critical to this discussion right now, which is I think find it fascinating, is that there will be, everyone here will be able to say, you come from this tribe, you come from that tribe, you come from that tribe. Now, most of us will come from the tribe of Judah or Benjamin. In fact, that's what the word Judah is, why we're called Jews, because most of us come from the tribe of Judah. But that you might be in for a surprise and find out that actually your great-great-grandfather came from a different tribe. And that's something that we believe that that the Mashiach himself will be able to identify. And interestingly, this has again been something that as the Jewish people we have kind of over the years taken for granted, that one of Mashiach's jobs will be to identify the Jewish people, from which tribes they come from. And more importantly, why is this important? Because the land of Israel will actually be divided, like it was back in biblical times, into tribal areas. And if you take a look in your book, in page 6, figure 6.2, page 256, this is a picture from a Haggadah that from 1695 that actually breaks up the land of Israel into the various different parts, each one from another tribe. So whether this, clearly you can argue whether this map is accurate or not, but what it tells us is, and I mentioned that earlier, that God is kind of like the symbol, the prayer for the coming of Mashiach. We saw that before with the song that sang at the end of the Seder. But here too, when we talk about the future redemption, we talk about Israel once again being divided up amongst the 12 tribes, because the 12 tribes will become once again known to the Jewish people. Okay, and let's move along. So we have the temple being just built, the gatherings of the exiles, and one other thing that happens in Mashiach, another thing that happens, and that is the recreation of the Sanhedrin. What is the Sanhedrin? Well, the Sanhedrin is this group of sages that was disbanded about 300 years after the second temple was destroyed. Now, when the Sanhedrin, what they're able to do is, it's the most powerful judicial Jewish body that has ever existed, and they have the ability to reinstate certain mitzvot that we no longer perform because all sorts of reasons. Let's take a look at some of the mitzvahs. We actually, before we get to the Sanhedrin, let's talk about some of those mitzvahs that will happen even without the Sanhedrin, with the coming of the Mashiach. So this is another fascinating piece of information. So right now, we know that there are 248 positive commandments. Of course, within those 248, there are many sub-levels of commandments, right, of how to perform the commandments and how to guard that we don't, the commandments that help us stay away from violating any of the commandments. But there are 248 different mitzvot that God gave the Jewish people at Sinai. this is a piece of fascinating Jewish trivia, right? If you're going out for dinner and you want to say, how many commandments do we do now while before the Mashiach comes? How many mitzvot are there? Not negative commandments like don't do this or don't do that, but positive commandments. Out of those 248, guess what? There are only 87 of those mitzvot that we're able to observe in times of exile before the Mashiach comes. Okay, so it's not that much, but don't worry, there's a lot, because of course within those 87 there are many sub levels of mitzvah, and there are additional rabbinic commandments that came along later, which were, by the way, very often were sanctioned by the Sanhedrin. But there are 87 biblical commandments that we have today to fulfill. Now, what are those commandments that we can let's take a look at some of those commandments that we can look forward to performing when Mashiach comes. One of them is the mitzvah of Hakel, which is when the king of Israel gathers the Jewish people in the temple every 7 years. Another is the Jubilee year, which was commemorated every 50 years. That's something that we can do only in the land of Israel and only when the Mashiach comes. And also for us, that we have a mitzvah to 3 times a year to go up to Jerusalem and celebrate the holidays in the Holy Temple. This is another mitzvah that will only happen when Mashiach comes, among many others. Most of the other mitzvahs, by the way, have to do with sacrificial offerings, which of course can only happen when the temple is being rebuilt. Okay, so we have this idea of the restoration of the mitzvot, the restoring of the mitzvot that we cannot do now. But then there's one more thing that we will have opportunity to do. And this is expressed in text number 7. And interestingly, that we say that the opening words of this prayer, of this prophecy, are included in the Amidah. Although slight variation on these very same words, but they are a prayer for the restoration of the judges. Let's read this. Trudy, would you like to read for us, please? Text number 7, page 256.
Okay. I will restore your judges as in the days of old, and your counselors as in the beginning. Afterward, you shall be called the city of righteousness, faithful city.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so what this is, and by the way, these first 4 words of this prophecy is a prayer that we say in the Amidah prayer. Very almost identical words, which comes from the book of Isaiah. So we talked earlier at the beginning part of this course how our prayers continuously reference the coming of Mashiach and prayers for this very time. Well, this prayer, the restoration of judges, that we say during the Amidah prayer, is a reference to the restoration of what judges? The Sanhedrin, the highest court that ruled the land of Israel and the Jewish people. The Sanhedrin were a group of rabbis who received what we call samicha. You may have heard of the word samicha before. It's a word that's typically used to confer a rabbinic title to a rabbi. But that's really a borrowed reference to what the real samicha was back in the day of the Sanhedrin. The samicha back in the day of the Sanhedrin was an ordination that was given to you by a judge or a rabbi who had himself received smicha all the way back to Moses. Now, I got smicha too when I became a rabbi, but I doubt that the rabbi can make such a proclamation that his smicha he was ordained by a rabbi going back to Moses. But back in the days of the Sanhedrin, those rabbis that sat on the Sanhedrin, there were 72 of them, each one of those, and the Sanhedrin lasted for hundreds of years, were ordained by a rabbi or a leader or a judge who had been given that same title by a previous generation going back to Moses. So it's a pretty prestigious title to have. And as you can imagine, having such a title, this rabbinic body has enormous powers to adjudicate Jewish law. As I said earlier, the Sanhedrin was disbanded. What's fascinating actually is that the Sanhedrin actually outlasted the temple, the second temple. So we kind of think that Jewish life in Israel finished when the Romans sacked Jerusalem, but actually not. Jewish life continued, albeit under enormous pressure of the Romans. We spoke last week about Rabbi Akiva, who tried to restore Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel through his belief in Bar Kokhba being the Mashiach. And it continued even after that, after Rabbi Akiva's times. But the Romans made it very, very difficult for the Jewish people to lead a Jewish life. And the Sanhedrin, even so it continued for a couple hundred years, it had to move from Jerusalem and continued in a city called Tiberia, which is up in the north, still in the land of Jerusalem, it was still in Israel. But after 360 years, it became too difficult to maintain, and it disbanded and has never been recreated. There's being talk. We had a JLI course about this a few years ago about people who had tried to re-establish the Sanhedrin, but that those were nice attempts, but never gained much traction. What's interesting, so we're talking about the rebuilding of the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin, this rabbinic body of 72 judges, when Mashiach comes, will not necessarily have to be, they won't sit in Jerusalem in the temple where they typically sat, but rather they are going to go back to the last place that the Sanhedrin sat, which will be in the city of Tiberia. Let's read this in text number 8, Tiberius first. Let's see. Yeah, Trudy. Steve, did you read? Steve Anderson.
Yeah.
Text number 8, Tiberia first. Thank you.
Originally, when the Holy Temple was built, the Supreme Sanhedrin would hold session in its chamber of hewn stone.
That was in the Holy Temple. Go ahead.
When things went awry, the Sanhedrin went into exile, convening in various locations, 10 in total, the last being Tiberias. Since then, the Sanhedrin has not reconvened. We have a tradition that the Sanhedrin will be restored in Tiberias first, and from there it will relocate to the temple.
All right, fascinating. All right. So if you're in Jerusalem, if you're in Israel, and you want to see when Mashiach comes and you want to see the reconvening of the temple of the Sanhedrin, head to Tiberias. Okay. So what are the Sanhedrin going to do for us? So here's another interesting piece of information, which I find fascinating. And as a Chabad rabbi, it's going to mess things up entirely, as you soon find out why. But it'll be worth it for the Mashiach, because even if it's a little inconvenient. So, one of the things that the Sanhedrin did in the times of the temple was that they established the Jewish months. So we know that there are 12 months in the Hebrew calendar, and they each month begins around the time of the new moon, right? The new moon goes on a 29-day cycle approximately, and on the 29th or 30th day, when the new moon begins, that is the beginning of the new Hebrew month. Now, back in the times of the Sanhedrin, fascinating, in order for the new month to be established, you couldn't just look on your calendar and say, oh, a new month is beginning today. It had to be established by people who came to Jerusalem and who had seen a little sliver in the sky of the new moon. They rushed to Jerusalem, gave witness testimony that they saw the new moon. So if they came on the 29th day of the month, then and they said they saw, I'm sorry, if they came on the 30th day of the month, then and they saw that the new moon had, they gave testimony that the new moon had been was visible the night before, then they would establish that day the 30th day being the day of Rosh Chodesh. If they had no one came, then by default, the next day would be considered Rosh Chodesh. So what this meant for most people was that they never knew when the holidays would fall. They would have to wait from a messenger from Jerusalem to give them the information what day of the month had been established as a new month, and then count many days till the date of the Jewish holiday. And so if it was Pesach, which is on the 14th day, they would count it either from a day earlier or a day later and count 14 days. And then a whole series of messengers that would make sure this information got out to the Jews around Jerusalem. Of course, this is why us in the diaspora have 2 days, because this information was never forthcoming with enough time to know when the holidays would begin. Now, what happened? During the times of the Sanhedrin, at the very end of the reign of the Sanhedrin, again, this is the year 360 approximately, there was a great rabbi called Hillel, not to be confused with Hillel HaZaken, Hillel, the elder that lived hundreds of years earlier. He did something that we benefit from till today, and he decided that he knew that they wouldn't be able to, the Sanhedrin wouldn't maintain itself any longer, and the Jews would have to have some way of calculating when the holidays would fall, and they rely on a certain calendar. So he created a calendar that followed a certain pattern that wasn't necessarily loyal to when the new moon is seen, but it accommodated holidays so they wouldn't fall out on certain days. That was I believe his bigger accomplishment. So for instance, I believe Yom Kippur can never fall out on a Friday, and certain other holidays have to fall out on certain days of the week. I believe that was his bigger accomplishment. Until today, we follow that cycle of calendars. We don't, and that's why sometimes Rosh Chodesh will fall out on a day or two after the actual moon is given birth, so to speak, or is actually begins anew. Then, because the Jewish calendar is not loyal to the moon, to the exact date of when the new moon begins. Am I making sense? Yep, hope so. Okay. Regardless, we have a calendar system today that for the next million years I can tell you when Yom Kippur will be in 2600 years from now. Just okay. Now, what is interesting is that when Mashiach comes, we're going to return to the calendar being established by witnesses. And this will make things complicated because technically witnesses could come on one day or they could come on a second day. And when if they came a day late, we would be establishing the new month at a day later. So as I said at the beginning of this, it would make things complicated for Chabad rabbis. Imagine we're putting out a Seder invitation for Pesach Seder to begin, to be held on, March 25th. I would have to include in saying, well, if the Jews in Jerusalem make the date a day later, it will be March 27th. So hold both dates just in case. And that's really what's going to happen. So it will mess up our plans, but it'll be worth it because all the other benefits of the Mashiach, of having the Mashiach here, will be well worth that inconvenience. But that's typically, it will be interesting to think that but we'll be more accurate because it will actually, Rosh Chodesh will actually fall out on the date or very close to the date, much closer to the date of when the new moon will be visible in the sky, as opposed to today where it could be a day or two off, okay? All right, so we're really behind time here. So let's move along to some of the juicier topics, which is Armageddon, right? This is, when I asked, have you anyone, what do you anticipate when Mashiach comes? Armageddon is perhaps one of the most well-known stories of what will happen when Mashiach comes. Now, what is Armageddon? Armageddon actually is a Christian word. which comes from the word Mount Megiddo. Can you hear that in the word Armageddon? Mount Megiddo, right? There's Megiddo in Armageddon, because the Christians believe that on this Mount Megiddo there's going to be a massive battle that the Christians will come out on top. Okay. They also call this apocalypse, which is a Greek word for a prophecy of suffering that will happen at the end of days. Well, this idea of Armageddon is actually which is being popularized by Christian belief. Like many of their beliefs comes from Jewish, has Jewish origins, and indeed the prophet talks about at the end of days there's going to be a big war. What they don't say is that it will take place on this mountain Megiddo like Christian sources do. So what Zechariah says, which is where this prophecy comes from, is that in the end of days there will be great mourning in the land of Israel or in Jerusalem, like the mourning that once occurred in the valley of Megiddo. So that is the Jewish source, okay? But it doesn't say that there will have to be a big war. It will just say that there will be a mourning like the war that took place in Mount Megiddo. Now, what will their mourning be about? It will be about a war that takes place that has a character called the King Gog and a name and people called Magog. So that's where you have the name Gog Magog. This is how it's known in Jewish sources. So Armageddon is a Christian reference to this great battle that happens in the end of days. Jewish sources say that it's a war between the king Gog and his nation Magog. In other words, those two people will be in a battle. Okay, so that's just a little bit of information about the differences of this Armageddon, Jewish sources, Christian sources, and how they differ. I'm going to skip the text. I apologize if I'm missing anybody who hasn't yet read. Let's just try to conclude with just the remaining 10 minutes what we have. Interestingly, Maimonides, who has been very descriptive in a lot about what happens in the time of Mashiach, while he talks about this as he does in text number 9 about the Gog and Magog, the war at the end prior to the Messianic times when the Mashiach's coming, he doesn't give a lot of details. So unfortunately, he's short on details, which leaves us that we don't know much about it, and it definitely doesn't mean that there has to be a great war with lots of casualties. In fact, what we do know is what the Talmud tells us, which is that, and again, this is text number 10, the Talmud tells us there are 2 chapters in Psalms, one right after the other. One talks about Gog and Magog, and the other talks about King David mourning, or not mourning, but being very sorrowful on the state of affairs with his son Aveshalom. And what the Talmud and what the commentaries tell us is that there is greater distress, but that in King David's description of his relationship with his son Aveshalom, who rebelled against King David, then King David's description in the war of Gog and Magog. This tells us something very important. It says the Talmud that we need to focus our attention not on the Gog and Magog, which King David doesn't give doesn't cry much about, but rather we should give greater attention to what King David is really crying about, which is his relationship with his son Aveshalom. That bothered him much, much more. And of course, King David was prophesizing about what would happen in Gog and Magog. It was something that would happen in the future, but clearly he's not bothered as much as he is by. And again, this is all in the difference in the language he uses in these 2 descriptions. And from here, the rabbis in the Talmud tell us that if we want to worry, and Jews love to worry about all sorts of things, it's much better to worry about our education of our children, that they should grow up to be fine Jews, than the end of days, the war between Gog and Magog, which we know anyway won't be such a big calamity, won't be such a problem. So that's the Jewish take on Gog and Magog. I'll leave off by saying that many Hasidic rabbis have said, the Hasidic tradition rather, is that throughout the year, that Gog and Magog, this great war that will happen, has already happened. In other words, we've already lived through 2,000 years of persecution. Many periods in Jewish history fulfill the prophecy of I think it was Zechariah, who describes the great mourning of the Jewish people. Take any persecution, even in the last 100 years, whether it was in Nazi Germany or not, even go back a few more hundred years, or Spanish Inquisition, just name the period in time, the calamity and the mourning the Jewish people have suffered fit the description of Gog and Magog, and the Hasidic commentaries believe that we are done with it. It's over. We're ready for the Mashiach without the Gog and Magog happening. Okay, and if we want to worry about something, it should be about our education, our children's education. Okay, let's move on. In the next few minutes, we have a long description about the physical blessings that Maimonides describes. This is in the Mishnah Sanhedrin. He wrote a commentary on the Mishnayos, and he goes through this entire very, very detailed description of what happens when Mashiach comes. So just to outline it for you, he talks about something that we all wish could happen, and it's happening already right now, but something we would wish it would happen even in greater, with greater extent, is the fact that in Mashiach's time we'll have to work little, but there'll be a lot of yield, right? So in a way, that's already happening in many ways, right? We have what do they call it? Harvesters that do the work of 1,000 men, and that's generally the way the times of Mashiach are seen as, that we won't have to work too hard. Just a little bit of work will provide us with the means to live very happily. And also we'll live for long times in this, Maimonides says, because we won't have to stress too much. Today a lot of our time is spent stressing about how to make a living, and that shortens our life and doesn't make our life as pleasurable as it could be. Guess what? We won't have to work so hard. We don't have to worry about our living. We'll live stress-free. But what is all this about? It's not so that we can just sit on the beach and drink martinis. Rather, as Maimonides concludes, it is because we'll have more time to spend studying Torah and helping people and living a more spiritual, more meaningful life. So what we see from here is two things. Firstly, Maimonides is very clear to reiterates what we spoke about at the beginning of the class, which is when Mashiach comes, there will be no major miracles. This is really a key point for tonight's class. Rather, we'll just have this greater, we'll live in a more greater abundance. We'll live longer because we'll be stress-free. These are not miracles necessarily. The world still continues to run on its regular course, natural means, but we work less, we live longer, stress-free. That's the first point that Maimonides makes. The second point he makes is that this is not just for the sake of it, but so that we can serve Hashem, we can use our time wisely. And this, I want to say, is something that we can begin doing right now. The Rebbe, which of course his inspiration for this course, spent hours and hours talking about Mashiach. One of the things that he spoke very often is that we are living in Mashiach times right now. In other words, in a preparatory stage for Mashiach. And we all have the fact that at 8:30 in the evening, all of you are sitting up watching a live class, and that's because you haven't worked 12 hours in the field the day before. Okay, I'm sure you've worked hard, but you haven't worked the laborious hours And there are people who do, but most of us don't have to, right? We can sit at our computer, we can have what we're doing and do our work. It's difficult, it's not easy, but we're already living in times that affords us opportunities to daven, to pray in the morning, to spend time studying, and still, and still have our day jobs. And that's something that we should recognize, that we're living in Mashiach times, and we have these opportunities, and these are gifts that Hashem has given us, not so we can just enjoy. Yes, enjoy, but there's also spend time to living a more spiritual, meaningful life. Let's just maybe I can go over this very quickly, and that is a big question that many of you may have. I think it's important to add, the resurrection of the dead. So first and foremost, clearly a point that we make in this class, and I'm sorry I have to rush through this, is seemingly Maimonides does not mention the resurrection of the dead in his description in Mishnah Torah, in halachic works of what happened when Mashiach comes. He does not mention the resurrection of the dead. Now, you remember we discussed this in great detail about the resurrection of the dead. How come Maimonides doesn't mention it? And this was actually held against Maimonides, and people felt that perhaps Maimonides is not mentioning it because he believes that the resurrection of the dead is to be taken only on a allegorical meaning, and it's not meant to be taken literally. And there was one particular activist, I think you might call him, who made quite a big deal about this. He says, "No, don't worry about you don't have to believe in the resurrection of the dead." Now Maimonides was forced to write an epistle and a letter, which is in text number 12, that reiterates his belief in the resurrection of the dead. So even so, Maimonides, throughout his texts, maintains that there will not be that the Mashiach's coming does not need to alter the natural path of the world, as we said at the very beginning of the class. However, he maintains, nonetheless, there still will be this supernatural event of the resurrection of the dead, and that's in text number 12. It's not part of his major works of the Rambam. It's in the letters of the Rambam, where he adds this and maintains that this indeed will happen, and it will be a miraculous event. Even if no other miracles take place, the resurrection of the dead will. It is important also to note that Maimonides does mention, as we said in the very beginning of the class, in other areas and other texts that he writes, including the 13 Principles of Jewish Faith by Maimonides, that is the belief in the resurrection of the dead. Now, that's one point. Another point we want to get to, which is a big question that some of you may have, and I want to try to get this in tonight's class, which is, how come if the resurrection of the dead is such a big deal, right? That even so Maimonides says if no other miracle takes place in the coming of Mashiach, there will still be the resurrection of the dead. How come it's not in the Torah, right? Not even a hint to it, I believe, in the Torah. No, there may be hints, but there's no actual. Moses doesn't tell the Jewish people that Mashiach will come and the dead will be resurrected. So how come it's missing? So Maimonides, in this very same letter, addresses this issue, and basically he says the following. And this is a belief, a fundamental belief in Judaism, that God, when the Jewish people left Egypt, they were in a state of spiritual despair. And basically what he says is, at that time, the Jewish people were not in any state to really acknowledge belief in all sorts of things. As we know, they served the golden calf shortly after going out of Egypt. In other words, they were in this very early stages of accepting God and as a person, as an entity that controls the world, and also the fact that he maintains this communication through prophets. The purpose of the many miracles and the going out of Egypt and the God's very visual communication with Moses is to emphasize these two main points to the Jewish people. which is A, God does work through miracles, hence God took the Jewish people out of Egypt through enormous amounts of miracles, and B, he communicates to us, the Jewish people and the world in general, through prophets, hence Moses, the giving of the Torah. So those two events were kind of the two main events that were meant to establish the concept of miracles and the concept of prophecy, which the Jewish people took years to fully acknowledge and to believe in and to accept. Hence, at that point, it would be inappropriate for God or the Torah to include in it this concept of a really unbelievable time as the resurrection of the dead. So God does not include it in the Torah itself, but he does include it in the many prophecies that the prophets later on revealed to the Jewish people. And by that time, the Jewish people have already learned that God communicates through prophets. And by that time, they're able to acknowledge and accept that indeed what the prophets tell us about the resurrection of the dead is something that they are ready to accept. But it comes on the premise that they have already believed in the concept of miracles as God performed going out of Egypt, and also in divine communication as God expressed by giving of the Torah through the Jewish people, through Moses and the miracles of Sinai. So this is the idea of why we don't, this explains to us why the resurrection of the dead was not included in the Torah, because the Jewish people just were not ready to accept it back then. They given the Torah, but they were much later on when they learned that God communicates through prophets and is able to perform major miracles as well. Okay, let's continue. One more point, and I'm running late. But on for the concept of two quick points, okay? And I am kind of minimizing what I'm saying just to be to the point. We're talking about the resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead says three major points to us about our there's three major points. First, why is it necessary? It's necessary because Judaism believes in reward and punishment. Jews the Messianic era is a reward for all the hard work that we have done over thousands of years, and therefore it's only fair that those who participated in creating that reality through the mitzvahs that they have performed, the good deeds that they have performed, should be around in a physical sense when Mashiach comes. That's point number one. So we can't just, that's why they have to be resurrected. But more importantly, or as importantly, it tells us something phenomenal about the whole, about the way God sees the role of the physical versus the spiritual. So if you can imagine, if you're a soul living, we are a soul, but if you can imagine souls that have finished their time, their mission in this world, they're now living the spiritual reality in some heavenly abode. Now Mashiach comes for them to continue their spiritual journey. What do they have to do? They have to regain, they have to come back to this physical world, enter into a body, and then that physical body is how they elevate and maintain their spiritual status. So this tells us something very unique about how we see the physical over the spiritual. Now, what is the most important thing for a human being to maintain is a physical relationship with God, because ultimately it will be in a physical body that the souls will receive their, so to speak, their just desert, their reward, the greatest reward, which is when the Mashiach comes and they will be resurrected in a body to be able to experience the Messianic reality. So it tells us a lot about, how great it's important. Spirituality is great, but it's expressed primarily through the vehicle of the physical things in the physical body in this world, not through some spiritual trance or out-of-body experience. And finally, one last point, and I'm really taking liberty of going this late, but this is, like, as I started the class, I'll end the class by saying that this is not something that one person gets to accomplish on his own, but it's a collective effort of thousands, millions of people from all walks of life. Every single person in this universe has a mission to fulfill. And every single mission brings us closer to that time. And we need to look at ourselves and the actions that we do, that every mitzvah that we do can bring this reality one step closer. And if we looked at our daily lives and saw everything that we do as a vehicle to bring the Mashiach reality one step closer, perhaps we'll be a little more meticulous in the observance of those mitzvahs. And indeed, I hope we all can be a little more meticulous in the observance of those mitzvahs, and indeed make this course not just a nice piece of Jewish literature, but a reality with the coming of Mashiach. He comes speedily. So thank you for joining us. It's been quite a journey. I really appreciate you being here with us on Zoom. And this concludes our third of 3 courses that JLI has prepared for us for this year. And I said that during the lesson, we might do one in the middle. I don't know. If you're interested, let me know about the third temple, about the building of the temple. Otherwise, we will reconvene in October with a great lineup of courses. JLI has released what those 3 courses are. The first one is on anti-Semitism. I forget what the other 2 are, but I saw them briefly and they look really interesting, and I hope you'll be able to join us for them. Meanwhile, have a wonderful evening, a great summer, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rabbi. Have a great week, everybody.
Shikoah.
Rabbi.
Bye.
Sorry, I was drowsy there, but.